So today we'll be speaking briefly on making African payments truly global. I know that payments are one of the most popular things we talk about, especially here in Africa. Why are we always talking about payments? What is the significance of payments, especially in our continent today? Before I dive in, let me tell a quick story about the role of African payment. 2, 3 years ago, my friend and I, who were working here in Lagos, we're working in Lagos, Nigeria, for companies abroad, always had the need of receiving payments, always had the need of receiving our salaries at the end of the month. But this was a very difficult and tedious process, right? And it made us thinking, what exactly is our solution to this problem? And so we sat and tried to figure out how can we solve this problem? How are other people solving this problem? And we realized that it was a larger problem across Africa. And we decided to build Gray to solve this problem where we help customers receive payments anywhere in the world, wherever they are working. So today I'm going to talk about this important work we've been building in payment. But beyond that, I want to touch on the larger scope of the role of African payments in putting Africans on the global map and making them competitive in the global economy. So, obviously, Africa has witnessed a surge in technological innovation, economic growth, um, and as such has positioned itself as a dynamic player in the global marketplace. Right. Even though Africa at some point was once described as being late to the digitization party, I think in the last few years, we've seen a lot of huge adoption. For instance, in 2022, we saw that over 48% of the population have access to digital banking services compared to 23% 10 years prior. We also see that African electronic payments market is expected to grow by 152% from 2020 to 2025. And we also see that total transaction value in the digital payments market is projected to reach about $195 billion in 2024. Obviously, this is a large improvement for the ecosystem for the continent. But despite that, we've still not attained the height we should be on the continent. And so it's important that even though we continue to embrace this revolution, we need to also make African payment systems not only useful for us domestically, but also globally. We need to think of how are we making global impact as an ecosystem. So next, let's go through some notable milestones of payments in Africa and see how we've evolved, seeing how we've actually grown. So payments in Africa really started booming in the early 2000s. We see that in 2007 was the launch of M-Pesa here in Kenya by Safaricom. And this not only ushered the wave of mobile money services in Kenya, but also in the entire markets, Africa at large. And then you start to see that in the 2010s, we started seeing new telcos also following the same route. So that expansion, that initial launch from Pesa, also propelled other networks, other telcos to pick up the pace. So we started seeing the likes of MTN, Airtel Money, and so on, launching in places like Tanzania, Uganda, and Ghana. In the mid 2010s, we started seeing a rise of fintechs in this space, popularly in countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya being the major hotspots. In 2018, we now see the launch of African Continental Free Trade Area, the AFC FTA. And then in the 2020s, we start to see a lot more regulatory developments. We start to see central banks issuing new and updated guidelines on mobile money operations, on payment operations across the continent at large as well. In 2021, we see the expansion of international payment platforms like Stripe, PayPal coming into the market to expand their services. And then very recently, in the last 2-3 years, we see the new digital currency initiatives. And so the next question we need to ask ourselves is, despite this growth we've made, despite the progress we've made, how exactly can we build trust? How exactly can we make African payments fully global? And I have a few things I want to touch on, particularly 4 things. The first one is building trust. Previous speakers have also spoken about building trust, and it tells you how important trust is in our ecosystem. The second thing is innovation. Third thing, regulatory clarity. And the last but not least, prioritize global inclusion. So trust, why are we still talking about trust? The problem today is we still have a trust problem in our ecosystem. And this is irrespective of the size of the company or the stage of the company. So you see that even traditional banks still face a problem of trust, where individuals can no longer trust them to a certain extent of sending cross-border payments. Why? Because of the outrageous fees and charges. For instance, I think a few weeks ago, someone wrote a Medium article about how they tried to receive money, and after sending the money, what got to them was about 70% of it, and about 30% of it was chopped off. So this is a trust problem because individuals, businesses want to be able to say, okay, I'm sending $1,000, you're getting $1,000. But we don't see that in our ecosystems today, especially with traditional banks. And then now you look at fintechs. Fintechs also have to overcome a trust problem because they're very new in the ecosystem, and so they haven't proven and shown that longevity that other traditional banks have shown. And so fintechs have to be as transparent as possible and have to outlive an average startup just to prove and show that longevity and build that trust in our ecosystem today. Why is trust important? Obviously, to help us build credibility as an ecosystem, to help increase and accelerate user adoption. The next one I want to touch on is innovation. I think this is one of the most important things about African payments, innovation. Because most times when we're trying to build products, we just sometimes want to clone what we have in other markets, maybe in the US, in Canada, and so on, and bring it down here without factoring in the unique intricacies and unique nature of our markets here in Africa. For instance, in the last few years, one of the major pain points for consumers and businesses in Africa has been credit. And so typically, in more developed markets, if you were going to try to build credit or give credit to a customer, all you needed was one ID or a tax ID or their identification number, and then you could instantly pull up all those records. But then here in our markets, you might not always have that luxury. So the question is, how then do you want to build credit for customers in this segment? One example of a good innovation I've seen is what a company Money is doing, where they provide credit to small businesses in groups of 5 to 25 members using social trust, so that each member of the group is sort of a guarantor for the other members. And so far, they have been able to disburse over 25K loans worth over $35 million with 99% payment rate. So this is an example of a very unique innovation that had to be done because of the unique nature of our market here in Africa. Innovation also can be achieved through partnerships. For instance, if you look at the case of M-Pesa as well, partnering with Visa to be able to offer virtual cards just to enable customers to be able to interact with a larger global audience. So innovation, African fintechs must constantly look at how to innovate, must constantly look at innovative ways to position ourselves in the global economy. The third thing is regulatory clarity. I mean, we cannot talk about payments without regulations. As some will say, it is a feature and it's not a bug. And in the last few years, we've started to see a lot of regulatory clarity in certain areas. For instance, in the cryptocurrency space, we've seen previously central banks were not very open to digital currencies, but very recently we're seeing central banks being comfortable having that conversation. We're seeing central banks starting to write their white paper on CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. We're seeing central banks starting to release regulations around this. So it shows that there's a lot more clarity coming in, especially with new payment forms that we are growing with. While there's a lot to be happy about, we still have some catching up to do as compared to other markets. I believe that we can always improve our own regulatory framework by creating sandboxes where fintech companies can work without having to bear the full burden of regulations, the strict regulations in the beginning. The final thing I want to touch on is prioritizing global inclusion. We cannot talk about making African payments global without us actually talking about how are we positioning Africans, that is individuals and businesses, to be on the global economy, to compete on the global economy. And so it's important for us to talk about global inclusion. How are we, African payments companies, African fintechs, how are we positioning individuals and businesses to the global economy? And there are a few things at top of mind I can think of that a typical African needs global access to. You look at education opportunities, you look at employment opportunities. Ever since 2020, COVID, everybody wants to work and live anywhere. And so Africans are looking for remote opportunities to work anywhere. How are we payment companies enabling these Africans to live and work anywhere? We see global and banking services. How can we African payment companies provide global banking services for nomads and remote workers? How are we positioning businesses for funding opportunities? We see very unique cases, for instance, like a company like Mercury in the US, where they have an investor database that, being a customer of theirs, you have access to. In fact, I think they also outsourced it. It's an open source database where anybody can get access to. That's one way they're thinking of positioning businesses for funding opportunities. And then we have global trade as well. I mean, payment is like the life and blood of trade, obviously. So businesses and individuals need to be able to buy and sell, shop from anywhere without finding it very difficult, right? And so these are examples of access. These are examples of problems that companies, that individuals and businesses need global access to. And so the question we need to ask ourselves today is, how are we positioning individuals and businesses within our space for this global economy? And that pretty much sums up my talk today. As payment companies, as fintechs, we need to think beyond how we're solving payments to help us domestically. We need to start thinking about global inclusion. We need to start thinking about positioning Africans to compete anywhere and everywhere. Thank you very much.